When we were talking and trying to figure out what to do for this week, money was suggested, and I was a little nervous about doing that. And I was trying to think of, like, why am I so hesitant to do a series of shows around money? Because it impacts all of us on a daily basis. And I was listening to NPR summer school series on money, and they said that economics is not about money, it's about power. And I think as a former refugee, I've always seen myself as being outside of that system. So for me, maybe that's why. But I wanted to get from all of you what your thoughts on, like, why is there a stigma? Well, there seems to be a stigma around talking about money. Shay, I'll start with you. Is there a stigma?
I think so.
Yeah.
It's still not something that we talk about a lot, and depending on the groups you're in, racial, class, all of that, if you're not taught about it, there's a bit of hesitance towards it. And I think in this day and age, we're judged on our ability to make money, how much money we have, and I think that comes into play. Yeah.
Does it make it awkward then to talk about money, or does it make you feel like you can't talk about money?
So me personally, because of the field that I'm in, I talk about money all the time. But depending on someone's trauma, their experience with money, maybe scarcity, their lack of money, it might be hard to admit that maybe they're not in the place that they want to be. Maybe they don't have a lot of money to spend. Maybe they don't have a lot of money to save. And again, that judgment, I think in this day and age, it's like everyone's expected to be super wealthy and have a certain level of materialistic things that if you don't have that, you don't want to have that conversation.
Brett?
Well, I think one of the reasons it's hard to talk about money is that it is an incredibly common experience. Everyone has some history with money and a present and a future with money. So everyone has a view. And so in that context, anything that you say about money is going to be tested severely against someone else's experience. No one is going to lack an opinion on money. So if you're going to intervene, you know that you're going to get a response.
Kaylie?
I think that the piece about power is so important. So we keep money private. Partially, in a workplace, you don't talk about how much money you make, because it might be very different from someone who's right beside you doing a similar job, and it can create awkwardness. So one of the ways that we sort of keep power is to keep that private. Maybe you make a lot more than someone, and so you want to keep it private in order to, I don't know, make sure other people around you don't feel a certain way. Or maybe you don't make very much and you're interacting with someone who you think has more than you, then you don't want to admit that there might be some weird imbalance that is really imaginary.
That's so interesting, because if you shared the information, you might get more power if you were someone who gets paid less.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And there was a law, and I can't remember where it sits right now, but at one time we were working on pay transparency laws in Ontario so that pay had to be announced or made public in a particular workplace. And the thought behind that is that most people's pay will go up as a result of that. But in the workplace, we all kind of stay quiet about it because it's a weird power dynamic, and we don't want people to know. Maybe we make more, or maybe we make more, and we don't want people to know that, or we make less and we feel embarrassed.
Craig, what do you think?
Oh, I think that money is a subject that leads to a lot of difficult conversations that people often aren't prepared to have. So I think every Canadian has a good idea of what they think money is. And the economics actually isn't about power, it's about scarcity. And money is really about taking the money you have and then making choices around what you're going to purchase with it. So money is often referred to as having power because money can be used in a way that can create a power sort of relationship. But I also think there's a big cultural dimension to this conversation.
What do you mean?
Well, I think, for example, older generations didn't share with one another how much they made in the workplace. My experience is younger Canadians that I've worked with are very transparent with their peers about how much they're making. They'll have conversations that I would never have.
Does that make you
when I was-
uncomfortable when you hear those conversations?
Well, to me, it ends up being a bit of a shock because from a culture point of view, I was brought up that this isn't the sort of thing that you had a conversation about. Like I don't talk to my friends how much money I make. We don't talk about how much debt we have. We don't talk about what interest we're paying. But I find younger Canadians actually are more open to having that conversation with their peers, and at least that's my observation. And I do think having conversations about it is healthy. I also think that there's a lot of there's an underlying hesitation of people to talk about money issues, partly because many don't have the financial literacy, or they think they don't have the financial literacy that is desirable, and so they're not willing to make themselves, in a sense, vulnerable by opening themselves up to those conversations.
I want to come back to what is money, what is scarcity, but this generational piece. Why do you think this generation or younger generations are actually being transparent about money?
Because I think we're being transparent about many things that we weren't transparent about in the past, and because the lack of transparency does ensconce and hide some of those power differentials and prevent them from being addressed.
So is it a
when we
way to
don't
we're
talk about
fighting
them.
back, or people are fighting back in a way? Or
You could put it as a fight back, but you could also point to it as an opening up, as an addressing of inequities and past discrimination. I mean, transparency on pay in the workplace is an incredibly powerful tool to overcome sexism in pay, racism in pay, and other impediments that have led to very differential circumstances for people from different backgrounds.
Kaylie, I see you nodding.
There's so many things going through my head right now, and some of it could be the difference between a more competitive generation and perhaps a more collaborative generation. I'm kind of
Competitive and collaborative. It seems like those are two different, the opposite
and
spectrum.
so if we're looking at a generation that maybe was a bit more competitive in terms of their own finances, whether or not they were community minded and like had something and then donated or provided support in their community after the fact, versus a generation that's more interested in building equality from the get-go.
And Shay?
Yeah, no, I was gonna expand on that. I've seen a lot of stories surrounding influencers specifically who are of different races making completely different money, and addressing that, being more transparent. Essentially, being more transparent means that more people can have a seat at the table and have the opportunity to build wealth, versus if we don't talk about it, then we will never know if we are, for example, making less than someone else who's doing the exact same thing. So I definitely am all here for that.
Craig, can you give us a definition? What is money?
Oh, sure. As an economist, I can give you a definition. But from the point of view of the general public, it's a very narrow definition, right? So it's the money is the currency that's currently in circulation. So that would be the coins and the dollar bills that we have, plus the money that is in bank checking accounts. It would be the most narrow definition of money. And the reason you include the checkable deposits is because it's highly liquid. You can immediately use it as if it was.
When you say liquid, you can just take it out.
Liquid meaning it's immediately available to you. You just write a check and there you go, right? So it's like when you turn over the check, it's like turning over a bill, because effectively what you've done is transfer some of your deposits to this other person. Then the definition can get broadened out, because there's other assets that you can very quickly turn into money. And so when the central bank talks about money, they talk about it in terms of different categories. And it all has to do with, from the narrowest, which is the coins and bills in circulation, plus the checking accounts, and then it adds on all these other assets that you can actually very quickly, within a very short period, turn them into cash.
Brett, what is money?
I would agree with all that, but I want to go down to a little more of a psychological and anthropological level
Okay.
with the discussion. I think, at its root, money is in some ways an
The
instrument
root of all evil?
power.
Sorry.
It's not the root of all evil. I mean, money can be used to commit evil, but it can be used to create beautiful things too. It can be used to create possibilities. So, to me, money at its most essential core is a unit of desire. A unit that expresses and can be used to implement how you would like the world to be, how you'd like an experience to happen, how you would like to shift
Is
that
it
desire
imaginary?
from one period to the future. Well, in and of itself, it's imaginary. The value attached to it is something that we give to it culturally, but it actually has a real representation. If you take part of your income and you put it aside, I see that as essentially desire or possibility that you're deferring into the future. If I pay you a bill, I'm giving you a possibility or desire to exercise as you see fit. Then building on that, economists talk about 3 core functions for money, one of which is that medium of exchange. You can use it in order to get goods and services from someone else. It is a store of value where you can save that desire, that possibility for a future point, and a unit of account that allows you to measure how you're doing or how a business is doing and compare that to others over time. Those
Kim?
are the 3 key things we look at.
When I was thinking about this sort of through the course of the week, my immediate thought was that it's a medium of exchange, which was one of the definitions that you just gave. Like, we have money, it's in cash in our pockets. Occasionally, it's also in bank accounts. We can access it through credit, like a credit card or a line of credit. And that it's just something that we have attached some kind of value to, and we use it to exchange.
It's very personal.
Yeah, it can be. It can be. Sometimes if you're buying something that maybe not a lot of people want, but you have a high value attached to it, like Freddie Mercury's shorts just sold for $18,000 or something like that. There's probably not very many people who are interested in buying that good, but someone was, and they were willing to pay a certain amount of money for it. And the person who sold it and exchanged it for money now has $18,000 that they can use in some other way.
And Shay, what do you tell your clients?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I also think it's important to highlight our perception of money, because that determines our attitude towards it. You had mentioned in joke, money is the root of all evil. There's a lot of people who think that, and that's affecting their ability to earn it, their ability to save it, how they use it. So I like to say that it's a neutral tool, and we have the power to direct it wherever we want it to. If we spend it in bad ways, then you could say it's bad, and if we spend it in good ways, then we can say it's good. But we, as you said unit of desire, like, we literally can give power to our money. And taking back our power when it comes to money is so important, because that's going to heighten our want to become more financially literate.
What you said about perception. Sorry, Craig, go ahead.
Well, when I was talking about what is money, I was talking about what is it, what is physically counted as money today. What Brett and Kaylie were talking about was what are the qualities of money? What it is a medium of exchange. It's a unit of count. It has to be divisible. And this is also why we can see in financial markets that we're now entering into a world where you can have digital currencies, right? So, what is money today, is narrowly defined, but what has the qualities of money, right, can be used as money. Like, the first money in Canada that was like a coin, was a brass coin stamped in 1870 that said it was worth 1 beaver pelt. The beaver pelt was being used as the unit of measurement to say, oh, if you want to buy something else, well, this is worth 10 beaver pelts, right? And so the nature of money is that it can change over time, right? So if we don't have money, we tend to create money, is a great example. So in the Second World War, inside prisoner of war camps, cigarettes became money. Why? Because you could say, well, I'll give you this, but you give me 5 cigarettes, and it's divisible, right? Because you could break them into pieces, and it was a store of value, because the prisoners would say, okay, well, then this is how much this is worth in cigarettes. Anything can be money, but the legal tender that we have today is the bills and coins in circulation.
Is value subjective to each person? Kaylie?
I think so, to a certain extent. There are some things that we buy that we're kind of price takers. If you go to the grocery store, for example, and want to buy a red pepper, that's the price. But when it comes to a haute couture bag, what you pay for it when you buy it, that's the price. Perhaps if you're selling it 2 years later, there might be a community that thinks the value is much higher because it was scarce, and they want that bag, and so then that has appreciated. One person might think that it's worth a lot, and another person very little, and so in that way, it's very subjective.
Yeah, I want to add, because scarcity then can change the value of something.
Can you give us a definition of scarcity and what that is first?
If there's a lack of something, like supply and demand, if there's a lack of something, but there's a high demand for it, then the value of it would increase in my mind.
Like a bag, like a designer bag?
Or if we talk about the pandemic and the lack of materials and toilet paper and stuff like that, there was a lack of an amount, and so the demand was high, and we saw the increase of prices due to that. So just continuing on what you said, when there's a lack of something, I feel like we value it more.
Why is that?
Collectively.
Why is that? Is that psychological, like you were saying before, or?
To some extent, I mean, it depends on the good. You know, some things like a designer bag has a meaning attached to it that goes above and beyond, you know, the leather, the brass, the zipper.
It's a status symbol.
There's a status symbol that's attached to it. And the price that gets assigned to it in markets is the result of an aggregation of subjective views on what it should be worth. So those prices in a freely functioning market aren't a function of someone just setting and deciding arbitrarily what it is. It is a result of all of those subjectivities coming together and being aggregated in a way.
Well, then how does money have value then?
And money's value is a reflection of that. If you look at exchange rates between currency in one country versus another, it is a reflection to some extent of investors and consumers' view on the creditworthiness of that economy, the extent to which it's going to grow over time, and their view on the prospects for economic growth in that country versus another.
Well, you mentioned currency, and it leads us to talk about currency. Where I come from in East Africa, the currency was a shilling, and so currency is different everywhere. Craig, can you explain to us what is currency?
What is currency? So it's the legal tender of the jurisdiction. Usually, I mean, again, when you get into digital currencies, it starts to get a little blended. But typically, what you're talking about is the legal tender of a country. And then, as Brett said, the value of that currency, you know, like so. Being money, right? It's you know, the legal tender of the country is generally going to be what is the accepted means of making a transaction. So that's the medium of exchange, right? You're going to say, you know, I'll give you $5 for that green pepper, right, at the grocery store, and that is accepted, right, as legal tender.
So why is the pound, the euro, and the dollar different?
Each country has its own legal tender.
But why does one have more? Why does one have more value, I guess?
It's a bit of like an artifact. It's not like stipulated like this is worth this many, like the number of Canadian dollars varies versus the value of the US dollar. It goes up, it goes down. Sometimes it's worth more, sometimes it's worth less. And usually the differential in the exchange rate reflects a whole variety of different factors within the economies, comparing the performance of the two countries, right? So if one country is less productive, like its workers produce less goods and services per hour worked, the value of the currency of that country is generally going to be lower. That's one of the reasons why the Canadian dollar is lower than the US dollar.
But if we value things differently, how do we agree upon one standard of money, which I guess would be
Well,
the
financial
American dollar?
markets trade on a daily, like when it comes to foreign exchange, they trade on a minute by minute basis, with traders basically valuing the currencies. And what ends up happening is they'll value them on a whole variety of different ways. Like, so for example, if interest rates in the United States are higher than they are in Canada, well, then investors are going to put their money in US dollars because they're going to get a higher return because they're getting paid more interest in the United States. And what that does is it leads the Canadian dollar to actually decline in value relative to the US dollar. So financial markets trade on a minute by minute basis, constantly valuing the currencies, and then you take the currencies and you make purchases with them, and then there'll be an exchange rate between the two currencies.
Oh, it hurts when you get that credit card bill, Kaylie. You buy something from the States.
Yeah, well, and I think it's really important to understand that, so we're holding Canadian dollars, and there are people who are making decisions, say between Canada and the US, as money is moving back and forth across like the virtual border, based on productivity, on interest rates, on other things that are happening. But those decisions are made every single day. And the value of our money then in Canada and our own bank account compared to the US is constantly changing, sometimes rapidly, sometimes, it's a very, very kind of level change or very small change. Exactly how that happens on a day-to-day basis, there's no way that I can explain that without doing a lot more research into how the people who are actually moving that money across the border are making that decision.
I think we'd also need a spreadsheet.
Oh yeah, for sure.
One thing to sort of make exchange rates a little more comprehensible is to think of them as the price of one currency in terms of another. So
There you go.
our exchange rate against the US dollar for our loonie is how many loonies it takes to buy a US dollar. If more people want US dollars, if more people want to invest, as Craig was pointing out in the US, then the price of a US dollar is going to go up because people are going to be scrambling to get those compared to the loonie. Over time, we generally think those exchange rates adjust to ensure that the value of Canadian dollars required to buy a Big Mac, say, in Canada is more or less equal to what it would cost to buy a Big Mac, that your purchasing power is relatively the same for the same product across different countries. But in terms of the actual number involved, it's not going to be the same because prices and productivity and the underlying cost structure of economies are different.
I wanted to get your thoughts on this final question. Can we live without money? Can our society function without money?
No.
No, money's essential. You sort of have to go to okay, now let's imagine a world if we didn't have money, right? Then we would have a barter system where you would actually have to trade goods. The economy would basically collapse in the sense that it would become extraordinarily inefficient and costly to make transactions. And the classic example would be let's say I own a horse, but I want a cow, but the person that's selling the cow wants 2 pigs. Well, now I got to go find somebody I can sell my horse to get 2 pigs to then trade to get the cow. I mean, that's what the barter system was like when we go back to pre-biblical times, right? The barter economy before we had money.
It seems to be making a comeback on social media. There's lots of bartering going on between people, but I guess that's on a smaller scale,
I mean,
right?
there's still bartering that's done, but it's not the primary means of exchange, right? And what money allows us to do is to make transactions very quickly, very efficiently, and we don't actually have to trade products back and forth in order to get an outcome that we desire, right? So we're unambiguously better off with money, and that's why I said that earlier that if you don't have access to money, we create it, right? We will find some other way of we will create something that we will now use as a medium of exchange, as a unit of account, and we will create it if it doesn't exist.
Shay?
I would say I agree. Yeah, that's You know what? At one point in my life, I said, why don't we go back to the time where we traded animals and rice and stuff like that? But you know, to agree with this point, it would make things a lot harder, because I'm just thinking like, okay, if I'm trying to purchase something from the States, how is that going to work, right? So I would agree to say that I don't think we can live without money. I think the key thing here is in some way trying to level out the playing field, which is kind of going back to the transparency of how much people make, but then also amplifying education so that we all are able to make the amount of money that's going to allow us to thrive.
And Brett, I'll give you the final point.
Well, I build on a couple points that were just made. One is that whenever money has been removed from a society, people have found new ways to create it. They might have, imbued sticks with the power of money, or coupons, or in countries that have had hyperinflationary episodes, like Argentina, they started using casino chips as store of value. The other thing about money is that it's ultimately empowering for people with very low income and very low wealth, because it does allow, as Craig pointed out, divisibility of transactions into very small sizes. And without that divisibility, you are stuck being unable to exchange with people either your labor for services or income, or your goods in the amounts that you want to actually trade with people.
And I guess it would involve a lot of coincidences to find exactly what you needed,
A lot of coincidences, and ultimately people who had a lot of assets would have an awful lot more power to trade than people with very few.
Well, this was a great way to start our week on money, and tomorrow we're going to be talking about what is a bank for. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Our guests all this week are
Shay Myers, licensed financial advisor and educator of Finance for the Culture. Craig Alexander, president of Alexander Economic Views. Brett House, professor of economics at Columbia Business School and fellow at the Public Policy Forum. And Kaylie Tiessen, economist and policy analyst at Unifor, one of the unions that represents some employees here at TVO.
The agenda in the summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.